the summer of 1889, while all of London held its breath waiting for Jack the Ripper's return, the murky waters of the Thames began yielding up a different horror. Body parts, carefully dismembered, scattered across the river like a macabre puzzle. But this wasn't the Ripper's work. This was something else entirely. Something that had been happening for years, overshadowed by the Whitechapel murders. This is the story of the Thames Torso Killer and the only victim who was ever given back her name. This is the story of Elizabeth Jackson, June 4th, 1889, early morning, the River Thames. It started with children playing by the water. Near Albert Bridge in Chelsea, 3 boys were throwing stones at something floating in the murky Thames. When they pulled it closer to shore, they discovered it was wrapped in white cloth. What they found inside would haunt them forever. It was a human thigh, severed cleanly at the hip and knee, wrapped in what appeared to be women's underclothing. The boys immediately alerted the Thames River Police. Within hours, Dr. Felix Kempster examined the limb and determined it had been in the water less than 24 hours. The body was fresh. The murder was recent. But this was only the beginning. Over the following week, the Thames transformed into a grotesque crime scene. More packages began surfacing. At George's Stairs in Horselydown, waterside laborer John Regan witnessed 2 more boys pulling another parcel from the water. This one contained flaps of skin, subcutaneous tissue from the abdomen, and horrifyingly, a uterus and placenta. A torso was recovered near Battersea Park. A left leg appeared under Albert Bridge. More body parts continued to surface day after day. Scotland Yard's chief surgeon, Dr. Thomas Bond, was called in, the same Dr. Bond who had examined Jack the Ripper's victims. He and other medical experts began the painstaking work of reconstructing the body. As with every other Thames Torso murder before this one, the head was never found. Without a head, identification seemed impossible. But then, investigators found something unusual. On one piece of the recovered underclothing, there were initials embroidered on the waistband: L.E. Fisher. This single detail would prove crucial. Metropolitan Police began investigating missing women matching the victim's description. A concerned father had written to one of his daughters, expressing fear that a missing family member might be the Thames victim. That woman's name was Elizabeth Jackson, though she went by Lizzie. Elizabeth was born on March 18, 1865 in Chelsea to Irish parents John and Catherine Jackson. She had 2 older sisters, Annie and May, and a brother named James. Life had not been kind to Elizabeth. By 1889, at just 24 years old, she was homeless and working as a prostitute in London's Soho Square. She had fallen on desperately hard times. In late April 1889, Elizabeth had been living with a man named John Faircloth, a millstone grinder and former soldier. He was known to have ill-used her, according to witnesses. The relationship was violent and troubled. Elizabeth wore a cheap brass ring and pretended to be his wife, though they were never married. Faircloth was the father of her unborn child. When Elizabeth's mother and sisters came to view the remains, they made a positive identification based on several unique features. The initials on the clothing. The underwear with L.E. Fisher had once belonged to another woman whose father had written her name on them. These clothes were thrown out as rags, and Elizabeth and Faircloth had purchased them from an old clothes dealer during their travels. A childhood scar, a distinctive scar on the victim's wrist from a childhood accident, was recognized by Elizabeth's mother. Vaccination marks. Marks on the victim's arm matched Elizabeth's medical history. Solemnly, despite the absence of the head, the identification was conclusive. On June 25, 1889, the body was officially identified as Elizabeth Jackson, Elizabeth. She became the only victim in the entire Thames Torso Murder series, spanning potentially from 1873 to 1902, who was ever given back her name. Immediately, police focused on Elizabeth's violent partner. John Jack Faircloth had left London around the time of her disappearance, traveling on a circuitous route that ended in Devon. The case against him seemed strong. Known history of violence toward Elizabeth. He had left London suspiciously close to her disappearance. He was the father of her child. He was a millstone dresser, itinerant work that gave him freedom of movement. An enterprising sergeant in Devon located and arrested Faircloth. He was brought back to London by a Scotland Yard detective for questioning. But then the alibi fell apart for the prosecution. Two of Elizabeth's friends, including one known as Ginger Nell, testified that they had seen Elizabeth alive and well heading toward Battersea just hours before her murder. This was a full 10 days after Faircloth had left London. The timeline proved beyond any doubt that Faircloth could not have killed Elizabeth. He was released from custody. The investigation had lost its only real suspect. Without Faircloth, investigators were left grasping at theories. Some speculated Elizabeth had sought an illegal abortion that went fatally wrong, the fact that her uterus had been operated on and removed after death, and that a piece of fine linen had been inserted into her body, a procedure naval doctors sometimes used for corpses at sea, seemed to support this theory. Elizabeth's friend Ginger Nell had warned her about sleeping outdoors on the Chelsea embankment, cautioning her of the rough character of the waterside laborers and their treatment of homeless unfortunates. Perhaps she had fallen victim to one of these violent men who frequented the Thames. Most investigators believed Elizabeth was a victim of the same methodical murderer who had been dismembering women since 1887, possibly as early as 1873. Elizabeth Jackson's murder was the third in what became known as the canonical 4 Thames Torso Murders. The Rainham Mystery, May 1887. A female torso pulled from the Thames. Body parts scattered across London over several weeks. Head never found. Victim never identified. The Whitehall Mystery, September to October 1888. Discovered during the height of the Jack the Ripper murders. A torso found at the construction site of New Scotland Yard. Scotland Yard literally had a murder mystery at their own headquarters. A reporter's dog found body parts police had missed. Victim never identified. Elizabeth Jackson, June 1889. The only victim ever identified. 8 months pregnant, dismembered with butcher-like precision. The Pinchin Street torso, September 10, 1889, found under a railway arch in Whitechapel. Showed signs of beating before death. Some investigators initially thought it might be the Ripper's work, but the dismemberment linked it to the Torso series. Victim never identified. What made these murders distinct from Jack the Ripper's work? Dismemberment, not mutilation. The Ripper mutilated abdomens and genitals, but left bodies largely intact. The Torso Killer methodically dismembered his victims. Disposal in water. Bodies were scattered in the Thames or left near the river. The Ripper left his victims where he killed them. Heads always removed. Every single Thames Torso victim was decapitated. This was clearly intentional to prevent identification. Skill and planning. The Torso murders required time, space, and anatomical knowledge. The Ripper's murders were frenzied, opportunistic attacks. Most modern experts believe
believe these were the work of two different killers operating simultaneously in Victorian London, an almost unbelievable coincidence of horror.
There were disturbing details about Elizabeth Jackson's murder that were kept from the public. A piece of fine linen had been rolled up and inserted into her rectum, a procedure that naval doctors sometimes performed on corpses at sea to prevent decomposition gases from escaping. Did the killer have naval or medical knowledge? Her uterus had been operated on and removed post-mortem. Why? Was this connected to her pregnancy? Was this an attempt at a crude abortion that turned into murder? One of Elizabeth's thighs had been thrown over the wall of the Shelley estate, owned by descendants of Percy and Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein. Was this the killer's sick joke, a literary reference to creating a monster from body parts? Investigative. Her right thigh was wrapped in the pocket of a costermonger's apron, perhaps a clue to the killer's occupation. Dark, chilling. Medical experts determined Elizabeth had been dead only 48 hours when the first body parts were discovered. This meant she was alive in early June 1889. Somewhere in London, she encountered her killer. He murdered her, though the cause of death could never be determined due to the dismemberment. He then spent hours carefully cutting her body apart with the skill of someone who butchered meat for a living. He wrapped the pieces, and he systematically disposed of them across the Thames, knowing the river would carry them away, scatter them, destroy evidence. But he had made one mistake. He hadn't removed all the identifying marks, the scar, the vaccination marks, the initialed clothing. And because of that mistake, Elizabeth Jackson got something none of the other victims ever received: her name back. When Elizabeth's remains were discovered, newspapers immediately speculated that Jack the Ripper had returned after his 7-month hiatus. The Central News Agency published claims that letters had been sent by the killer, later proved false. London was gripped by panic. But veteran detectives who had worked the Ripper cases disagreed. This was different. This was the Thames Torso Killer. In a bizarre administrative detail that highlights the confusion surrounding the case, Elizabeth Jackson was issued 2 death certificates. Certificate 1, Stepney Shadwell, listed death as occurring in the River Thames off Wapping in June 1889. Cause, found in the River Thames. No evidence of the cause of death. Certificate 2, Wandsworth East, Battersea, for body portions found between June 4th and 17th, 1889. Even in death, Elizabeth was divided. The tragedy of the Thames Torso murders is that Elizabeth Jackson is an exception. She is one voice among the voiceless, one name among the nameless. At least 3 other women, and possibly as many as 6 to 8, were murdered and dismembered by the same killer. We will never know their names. We will never know their stories. Their families never got closure. They were marginalized women, prostitutes, homeless, poor, the kind of women Victorian society preferred to ignore. In life, they were invisible. In death, they remained so. In 2024, researcher Sarah Bax Horton identified a new prime suspect, James Crick, a Thames waterman and lighterman who knew the river intimately. Crick had a history of violence against his wife and was later prosecuted for attempted rape. His occupation gave him perfect knowledge of the Thames, access to boats, and the ability to dispose of bodies efficiently. Could Crick be the Thames Torso Killer? We may never know with certainty. The murder of Elizabeth Jackson remains officially unsolved after 135 years. No one was ever charged. No one was ever punished. But her story matters because it reminds us of something crucial. These were not just torsos or mysteries or cases. They were women. They were daughters and sisters. Elizabeth Jackson was someone's child. She was 8 months pregnant with a baby who would never be born. Victorian London had 2 serial killers operating at the same time. Jack the Ripper became infamous, a legend, the subject of countless books and films. The Thames Torso Killer faded into obscurity, remembered only by historians and true crime researchers. Elizabeth Jackson's murder was overshadowed by the Ripper hysteria, but her case teaches us that sometimes the most shocking crimes aren't the ones that dominate headlines. Sometimes horror hides in plain sight, dismissed because their victims were considered disposable.
What do you think happened to Elizabeth Jackson? Do you believe James Crick was the Thames Torso Killer, or was there another explanation? Leave your theories in the comments below. Remember, these weren't just mysteries. They were people. Until next time, stay curious and stay in the shadows.